There's a moment, and I know this sounds like I'm exaggerating, but I promise you I'm not. There's a moment right before something massive happens where the air in a room changes texture. Not temperature, not pressure, texture. Like the molecules themselves have gotten nervous. I felt it that day, standing in the back of the grand reception chamber on orbital station Viral, wearing a pressed cadet uniform that was a half size too big in the shoulders, and holding a datapad I'd stopped actually reading about 20 minutes prior. I felt it the way you feel a storm coming when you grew up on a coast, something low and electric and inevitable. I just didn't know what I was feeling yet. I didn't know it had a name. His name was Sergeant Dale Morrow, and the room went silent when they found out where he came from. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. Let me tell you how the morning started, because context matters, and because the beginning of the story is the only part that still feels almost ordinary. Orbital Station Viral hangs in the middle of what the Galactic Compact calls the Neutral Corridor, a thin strip of designated non-territorial space that runs between the outer rim of Cavith, sovereign territory, and the edge of the Thalari expanse. It was built 47 standard years ago as a neutral meeting ground, back when the first interspecies commerce treaties were being negotiated, and it's been expanded so many times since then that it doesn't really have a clean architectural identity anymore. One section looks like a Thalari crystalline spire, another looks like a Cavith pressure vault, and then there's the human-built wing, which is all functional gray corridors and cable management and ventilation systems that actually work, which the station engineers, 3 different species, quietly rely on but will never publicly acknowledge. The station runs on compact standard time, which is a polite fiction that nobody fully believes but everyone agrees to observe, the way you agree to the idea that the meeting starts at 9, even though you know it won't actually start until 9:20. By compact standard, it was 6:14 when Ambassador Sierravel Thrin arrived. She came in on a Thalari courier vessel, silver hull, swept back like a bird mid-dive, and she came in early, which was a deliberate thing. Thalari diplomats arrive early when they want to establish presence, when they want the room already shaped around their arrival instead of shaped for it. It's a power move, not aggressive exactly, just territorial in a very quiet, very precise way. I know this because I'd spent 3 weeks before this assignment reading everything I could find about the Thalari protocol. I was 23. I was trying very hard to be prepared. Ambassador Thrin was impressive in the way that senior Thalari officials almost always are. She stood about 2 meters tall, with that characteristic bioluminescent ridge along the crown of her skull that pulses slowly. The way breathing pulses, just present, just constant, shifting between a cool silver white and a pale gold depending on her emotional state. Her robes were deep violet with silver threading, the kind of textile that costs more than my family's house back on Meridian Station. She had 6 fingers on each hand, all of them moving with that slow, deliberate Thalari elegance, like everything she touched was being considered before contact. She was, by every objective measure, the most important non-human I'd ever been in the same room with. And yet, what I noticed first, what my eyes kept going back to without my permission, was the figure standing 3 steps behind her and 1 step to her left. Human, clearly unmistakably human, in a way that stood out on Viral the way a rough-cut stone stands out in a box of polished jewels. Not because he was ugly, he wasn't, but because everything else on that station was optimized and curated and smoothed down, and this man was none of those things. He was built like a load-bearing wall. I don't know how else to describe it. Not tall in the dramatic sense, maybe 6'1", 6'2" at most, but dense in the physics sense of the word. Like someone had packed more mass into his frame than the volume should have been able to hold. His shoulders were the kind that made you think, unconsciously, those are functional shoulders, not decorative. His neck was thick and straight. His hands, hanging loose at his sides, were large and scarred in ways that told stories I didn't have the vocabulary for yet. He was wearing the dark gray dress uniform of the Diplomatic Security Corps, clean, pressed, every insignia in the right place, but wearing it the way a working tool wears paint. It was covering something rather than representing something. His face was calm, and I mean calm in a particular way, the way a still lake is calm over deep water. Not peaceful, not relaxed, just settled, like he'd made his peace with whatever was about to happen before the day had even properly started. sergeant stripes on his sleeve, a single service decoration on his chest that I couldn't identify at the distance. I didn't know who he was, not yet. None of us did. Let me explain how the bodyguard assignment worked, because it matters to what happened later. When a diplomat of Ambassador Thrin's rank requests additional personal security for a multi-session treaty summit, which this was, a 4-day gathering of 6 species representatives to renegotiate trade corridor access through the outer Thalari expanse, the Diplomatic Security Corps provides personnel from what they call the Combined Protective Detail. It's a mixed unit. Usually you get 2 Kavith officers, a Thalari liaison, and a human lead, because that's the standard configuration that the Compact Security Council agreed on 12 years ago as the template. The human lead position specifically is assigned by the Earth Human Representative Office, and they have their own criteria that nobody outside EHRO fully understands. What I knew, as a cadet observer, was that whoever EHRO sent was cleared at the highest level and had been personally vetted for close protection detail. What I did not know, what apparently almost nobody in that reception chamber knew, including some very senior people who absolutely should have received the briefing, was where specifically Sergeant Dale Morrow had come from before the Diplomatic Security Corps. That information was in his file that had been submitted 2 weeks ago. His file that had apparently been reviewed by exactly 3 people in the entire station administration, and those 3 people were currently standing on the far side of the chamber near the refreshment alcove, talking to each other in low voices, and shooting occasional glances toward the sergeant with an expression I'd later be able to identify as quiet dread mixed with professional admiration. At 6:14, none of that context existed for me. He was just the bodyguard, the human one. I watched him because I watch people. It's what I do. It's what got me the cadet observer position in the first place. My academy evaluators noted what they politely called a preternatural attentiveness to behavioral microindicators, which is a fancy way of saying I notice things, and I can't really stop. What I noticed about Sergeant Morrow in those first few minutes, as the ambassador and her party were being greeted by Station Administrator Pelvas and the Compact Protocol officers. He never looked at the same spot twice, not in a nervous, darting way, in a systematic way. His eyes moved through the room in sweeping patterns like someone conducting a physical audit. Exits, vantage points, the ceiling grid where the environmental systems ran, the crowd positions, the station personnel. Me, and here he held for exactly 2 seconds before filing me away as non-threat and moving on. When people moved in his peripheral vision, his head didn't snap toward them. It drifted, barely perceptibly, tracking the movement and assessing it without ever making the person feel tracked. When a junior protocol officer dropped a datapad nearby, it clattered loud on the station's composite flooring. His right hand moved approximately 2 centimeters before he stopped it. The movement was toward where a sidearm would have been, on a uniformed officer who was armed. He wasn't armed for this ceremony, diplomatic convention, no visible weapons in the greeting chamber, so there was nothing to reach for, and he knew that, and his hand stopped. But it moved. And the movement itself, that 2-centimeter displacement and immediate correction, told me something. It told me that his training was deeper than conscious thought. That somewhere underneath the pressed uniform and the still face, his nervous system was already doing a different job, one that didn't take breaks for diplomatic ceremonies. That observation sat in the back of my mind like a splinter for the next 2 hours. The morning session was standard treaty summit procedure. The delegates gathered in the grand reception chamber, which sounds impressive, but is really just the largest interior space on Viral that can accommodate multiple atmospheric conditions simultaneously, meaning the Thalari sections run slightly cool and blue spectrum lit, and the Kavith sections run a bit warmer with filtered redshift lighting, and the human section is just normal, which the other species find blandly confusing. There were 6 delegations: Thalari, Kavith, Ornathi, Sefri, the Compact Administrative Body, and the Earth Human Representative Office, plus support staff, security personnel, technical observers, and people like me, cadets assigned to observe and document and stay out of the way. Ambassador Thrin was the senior delegate, which meant protocol placed her at the head of the primary table. Her personal bodyguard, Sergeant Morrow, took his position at the required 2-meter standoff, which is the diplomatic security standard. far enough to avoid the implication of threat, close enough to function. He stood there for 3 hours. Not sat, stood. Which, for context, the Cavith security officers rotated every 40 minutes because standing for extended periods without weight redistribution is uncomfortable for their physiology. The Lowry liaison sat in the designated observer seat about 90% of the time. Even the other human personnel in the room had found chairs or leaning positions by the second hour. Sergeant Morrow stood for 3 hours. In the same position. Not rigid, not parade ground stiff, just present, weight balanced, eyes moving, the very specific stillness of something that could move explosively at any moment and was simply choosing not to. By hour 2, I'd noticed that a few of the other delegates' staff were occasionally glancing at him, not with suspicion, just that human behavior of noticing something that doesn't fit the pattern. Like when you're in a room and there's a sound that shouldn't be there and you keep looking for where it's coming from, except in this case it was a silence that shouldn't be there. A stillness. By hour 2.5, one of the Sefri junior diplomats, young one, probably newly stationed, had whispered something to a colleague while not very subtly glancing at the sergeant. The colleague had shrugged. The junior diplomat kept looking. I wrote it down in my observation log. Something about the human security officer is drawing secondary attention. Nature, uncertain. Tone, curious, not hostile. I'd underestimated what was building. The lunch recess was at 11:30 compact standard. The delegates filtered into the adjacent hospitality suite, where the catering arrangements involved a truly impressive feat of interspecies dietary accommodation. Separate environmental zones for the food sections that the Ornathi could consume versus what the Cavith could handle versus the human selections, which were, apparently, baffling to several species because of how conceptually random human nutrition seems from the outside. I took a position near the far wall where I could observe the room without being in anyone's way and ate something from the human section, a wrapped grain thing, I don't even remember what, and watched. Sergeant Morrow did not eat. He stood at his designated post near the door, which was protocol. The protective detail doesn't eat during active duty hours. But what caught my attention was that 2 of the catering staff, Ornathi, had positioned a small tray near him at some point. A courtesy gesture, leaving something accessible. And he'd made brief, neutral eye contact with them and given one slight nod that seemed to convey both acknowledgement and declination without a single word. The Ornathi catering staff member had looked at him for a long moment afterward, then glanced at his colleague, then back at Morrow. Then the first staff member said something to the second in their native clipped consonant language, and the second looked, and then they both quietly went back to their work. I was close enough to catch the sound but not the meaning, but I made a note. After lunch, things shifted. The afternoon session moved from the grand reception chamber to the treaty negotiations suite, which is a smaller, more intimate room. Fewer observers, fewer support staff, just the primary delegates, their closest aides, and their personal security. Ambassador Thrin's party moved through the corridor between the suites in a loose formation, 2 the Lowry aides in front, the ambassador in the middle, Sergeant Morrow 3 paces behind her and to the left, where he'd have a line of sight to the front pair and the ambient approaches from both side corridors. I was walking about 6 meters back, far enough to be clearly observer, not participant, just watching, just noting. There were about 30 seconds in that corridor, between the hospitality suite door and the junction with the main corridor, where something happened. I'm going to describe it as carefully as I can, because I've replayed it many times and I want to get it right. A Cavith security officer from another delegation's detail was moving in the opposite direction in the corridor. Standard traffic situation. Both parties would pass each other in the available space without issue. The Cavith officer was large. Cavith are generally in the 4-meter range, wide-shouldered, their exoskeletal plating giving them a silhouette that tends to dominate doorways. He was in full dress uniform, armed with the ceremonial side weapon that Cavith personnel are permitted to carry in corridor spaces, even when the greeting chamber rules prohibit it. There was nothing hostile about his posture. He was just moving through a corridor. But something about the angles. The corridor was slightly narrower than standard near that junction, and the Cavith officer's approach trajectory would bring him within about 1.2 meters of Ambassador Thrin at the point of crossing. That was within Sergeant Morrow's operational threshold. I saw it happen in about 1.8 seconds. Morrow stepped diagonally forward and left. Not fast, not aggressive, just smooth. He placed himself exactly between the approaching officer and the ambassador's position, maintaining his own movement so it looked, to a casual observer, like he was just adjusting his walking path. The angle of the step was precise. It closed the gap between Morrow and any potential vector toward the ambassador, while simultaneously opening the corridor space for the Kavith officer to pass comfortably on the far side. The Kavith officer moved past without incident, without so much as a disrupted step. Ambassador Thrin, who was in conversation with one of her aides, didn't notice. Nobody seemed to notice. Except me. And I realized a moment later, except the Kavith officer. Because after he'd passed, he slowed, not stopped. Just slowed for 2 steps, his head turning slightly, a Kavith's version of a backward glance. He looked at where Sergeant Morrow was now, having already flowed back to his standard position as if the step had never happened. The Kavith officer held that look for a moment. Then he turned forward and walked on. And his pace was slightly different after that, more considered, like he was carrying a small new thought. I wrote in my log, the human security officer performed an intercept reposition so smooth it was effectively invisible to the protected party. The Kavith security officer noticed. Reaction, recognition, possibly reassessment. I stared at that note for a moment. Then I wrote under it, "Who is this man?" The afternoon session lasted 4 hours. The treaty negotiations suite was smaller and closer, which meant I was seated at the observer bench maybe 8 meters from Sergeant Morrow's position rather than the 15+ of the morning. I could see him clearly, could watch in more detail. What I noticed in that 4-hour stretch, he breathed very slowly, like noticeably slowly for a human in an active-duty context. Long, low inhales, controlled exhales. The kind of breathing pattern I'd read about in material on high-performance human athletes, and my notes from 3 weeks of reading clicked together in combat survival training documentation. He blinked at a rate that was below average for humans in a sustained visual monitoring task. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like I was counting a man's blinks. I kind of was. I was a cadet observer with a datapad and 3 hours, and a growing, inarticulate sense that I was watching something I didn't fully have the context to understand. His hands never closed into fists, even during a tense exchange between the Ornathi delegate and one of the Kavith trade representatives. When voices raised enough that the room's ambient tone shifted, his hands stayed loose. Open, ready to become something else if they needed to, but choosing not to. At one point, hour 3 of the afternoon session, around 15:20, Ambassador Thrin said something in the Lari to one of her aides, and both of them glanced briefly at Sergeant Morrow, and the aide laughed softly, and the ambassador's bioluminescent ridge pulsed briefly gold. Amusement, warm amusement. I wondered what she'd said. I'd find out later, I'll tell you when we get there. The session ended at 16:40. The delegates dispersed to their quarters for the evening rest period before the second day's negotiations. I filed my observation log, ate something from the station commissary, and spent an hour trying to find information about Sergeant Dale Morrow in the publicly accessible personnel directories. His base-level record was there. Name, rank, assignment, current posting, standard DSC header photo which confirmed the face. His service history before the Diplomatic Security Corps was listed as Classified, Earth Human Representative Office, Restricted Access Tier 3. Which, for a sergeant in a close protection role, was unusual. Tier 3 restriction means military-grade classification. Means the specifics don't surface without active clearance request and approval from the EHRO Office of Personnel, which takes, I looked it up, a minimum of 10 working days to process for non-EHRO staff. I sat with that for a while. Then I wrote in my personal log, I think something significant is going to happen tomorrow. I don't know what. But something about this man, and the fact that nobody in that room seems to know who he actually is, feels like a pressure system looking for somewhere to break. I was right. I just had the mechanism wrong. Part 2, the storm that came in quietly. Day 2 started with something I wasn't expecting. Sergeant Dale Morrow arrived in the commissary at 4:30. I was there because I sleep badly in unfamiliar places, and I'd given up on sleep around 400, pulled on clothes, and gone looking for coffee, which the station provides in a universal approximation that isn't quite right but is better than nothing. It was one of those low, quiet hours where a place feels like its own skeleton, all the structure there, none of the life. He was at one of the corner tables, not eating, not reading, just sitting with a mug between both hands looking at the middle distance. I almost didn't go in, something felt like intruding. But I was already through the door and he'd already clocked me, that peripheral movement track, his head not turning but his eyes finding me, so backing out would have been awkward. I got my coffee, I looked around. He was the only other person in the commissary. I made a decision. I went and sat 2 tables away, facing generally the same direction he was, and I didn't say anything, just drank my coffee. 3 minutes passed. Then he said, without looking at me, "You're the cadet who's been watching me." Not accusatory, not amused, just stating a fact. I said, "I'm an observer. I'm supposed to watch everyone." He said, "You watch everyone else differently." And then he went back to his coffee and the middle distance. I said, "Where are you from?" before DSC. A pause, long enough that I thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, "Far from here." And that was it. I finished my coffee and left, because I had enough sense to know that pushing a man like that at 4:30 in an empty commissary was not going to produce useful information. But what he'd said stayed with me. Far from here. Said with a particular quality of flatness, like the distance wasn't just geographical, like it was something he'd already folded up and put away and wasn't planning to take back out. Day 2's negotiations were scheduled to address the specific corridor access terms, the technical meat of the treaty, the part where the numbers and routes and exclusion zones get argued about in detail. These sessions tend to be contentious, not because anyone is operating in bad faith, but because the interests genuinely don't fully align, and finding language that everyone can agree to is the kind of grinding, frustrating work that makes diplomatic summits last 4 days instead of 2. By 900, the Ornathi delegate, Presser Vin, was already pushing hard on the access window timings. His species has a fundamentally different conception of transit rights than the Thalari, and the gap between their positions had been the central sticking point in corridor negotiations for the better part of a decade. Ambassador Thrin was handling it with the particular brand of Thalari precision that makes them formidable diplomats, never raising her voice, never seeming frustrated, just deploying language like a scalpel, cutting exactly where needed and no further. I was doing my observer thing, back wall, datapad, watching. And then around 9:40, something shifted in the room. It started small. One of the Kavith security officers, not the one from the corridor yesterday, a different one, stationed near the Kavith delegation's side of the table, had been having a quiet conversation with another Kavith aide near the back of the room. Normal enough, happens during negotiations. But then the aide pulled up something on a personal communication device. Something that apparently arrived in a transmission during the session, and the security officer looked at it, and his posture changed. Kavith don't show emotion the way humans do. They don't have mobile faces in the human sense. But their postural communication is complex, and once you've studied it enough to start reading, fairly transparent. What I read was surprise rapidly being suppressed, followed by something that looked a lot like respect for something you weren't expecting to respect. He looked up from the device, looked across the room. At Sergeant Morrow. Just for a moment, then he looked back at the device, said something low to the aide. The aide looked at Morrow too. I made a note. Then about 20 minutes later, one of the Sefri aides near the front of the room, completely different delegation, unconnected to the Kavith exchange, did something similar, checked a device, paused, looked at Morrow, looked away quickly. I put my datapad down. Something was circulating. I found out what it was during the late morning recess. The Compact's protocol coordinator, a middle-aged Ornathi named Tresven, found me in the side corridor where I'd stepped out to review my notes. Tresven was the sort of bureaucrat who had survived 40 years of interspecies diplomacy by noticing everything and sharing information selectively, and she was looking at me with an expression that said she'd decided I was a good person to share something with. She said, "Cadet Malik, you've been observing the human security officer." I said that was part of my assignment. She said, "Are you aware of his service history?" I told her his file was restricted at Tier 3. She said it was. As of this morning, there's been a partial declassification. EHRO issued a background context release to station security leadership. The document apparently propagated into the general station personnel network through an administrative oversight about 40 minutes ago. It's been recalled, but she paused. Information of that nature travels faster than recalls. I asked her what was in it. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "His name in the file is listed as having come from the 14th Terran Combat Response Unit, which is based out of Karath 7. I stared at her. I said, "Karath 7. She said, "Yes." And then she walked away, because she'd said what she came to say, and she didn't need to explain the rest because she clearly expected me to already know why that mattered. Here's why that mattered. Karath 7 is not a planet. It's not a station. It's a small, rocky, atmospherically marginal moon orbiting the gas giant Karath in the outer edge of what the Galactic Compact classifies as the contested margin. The contested margin is a region that has been, over the past 60 years, the site of 8 separate military engagements between Compact member species, mostly resource disputes that got out of hand before the diplomatic channels caught up. Karath 7 specifically was the site of what the historical record calls the Karath 7 incident, and what the humans who were there call the 17 days, and what other species who are willing to talk about it at all call something that translates roughly as the thing we don't discuss in joint sessions. Here is the short version. 62 years ago, Karath 7 was being used as a resupply point by a small coalition of human settlers and off-world traders operating in the margin. It had no formal military installation. It was civilian infrastructure. About 300 human inhabitants, a mix of permanent and transit population. A faction-aligned Kavith fleet, not official Kavith military, a splinter group operating in the instability of that period, blockaded the moon for 17 days. Their goal was the tech and fuel infrastructure the settlement had built. The conventional calculus said the settlement would have to surrender, because they had no military force, no warships, no formal compact protection, and the blockade was cutting off resupply. What happened instead is the thing that didn't get into many textbooks, but is apparently very well remembered in both Kavith military tradition and EHRO internal documentation. The settlers didn't surrender. They fought for 17 days using nothing in the military sense, which means no ships, no formal weapon systems, no artillery. What they had was the infrastructure of the settlement itself. Environmental systems, mining equipment, the terrain of the moon, and whatever technical improvisation the 300 of them could produce with their hands and their knowledge, and the absolute conviction that they were not going to hand over everything they'd built. At the end of 17 days, the blockading fleet withdrew. Not because they were defeated in a conventional sense, but because the cost-benefit analysis had collapsed entirely. What they'd thought was a simple surrender scenario had turned into something else, a demonstration of the particular human capacity for asymmetric persistence that, once witnessed at close range, tends to recalibrate whoever is watching. The Kavith military leadership at the time filed a report that apparently used a phrase that translates into galactic standard, as they fight like something that doesn't understand the option of stopping. The 14th Terran Combat Response Unit was formed in the aftermath of Karath 7. It was a specialized unit, small, secretive, trained specifically in the kind of no-resource asymmetric engagement that the Karath settlers had conducted out of necessity. They were the people Earth sent when the situation had run out of conventional options. Sergeant Dale Morrow had served in the 14th Terran crew, for the declassified document apparently specified, 11 years before transferring to the Diplomatic Security Corps, which meant that the quiet, still-faced man standing 2 paces behind the Thalari ambassador, wearing a pressed gray uniform, with his hands loose at his sides, and his eyes moving in their slow, systematic sweep, was someone who had spent 11 years learning to fight like something that doesn't understand the option of stopping. By the time the afternoon session convened, The information had moved through enough of the support staff and secondary personnel that the room was different. Not visibly, not dramatically. Nobody stood up and announced anything. The negotiations continued the way negotiations continue, with their measured cadence and their careful language. But underneath that, in the way people positioned themselves, in the direction of the occasional glance, in the micro-adjustments of body language, the room knew something it hadn't known before. Sergeant Morrow didn't know they knew, or if he did, he gave no indication whatsoever. He stood at his post. His eyes moved, his hands stayed loose, his breathing stayed slow. The Cavith senior security officer, the one from the corridor yesterday, I saw him arrive for the afternoon session, came in, located Morrow immediately, and then did something I wouldn't have predicted. He chose a standing position on the same side of the room. Not aggressive, not confrontational, just chose to be on the same side. I wrote in my log, Cavith SSO has repositioned to shared lateral alignment with human security officer. Possible significance, tactical acknowledgement. Ambassador Thrin seemed unaware of any of this, which, in retrospect, was the thing that made what happened next so significant. Because when the climax came, it came fast, and it came real, and the ambassador found out about her bodyguard the same way the rest of the room did, by watching him. Part 3, the moment the room went silent. It was day 3, the third morning, 9:17 by station time. I want to set the scene carefully, because I want you to feel the exact quality of the ordinary before the extraordinary breaks through. The treaty negotiation suite was settled into its third-day rhythm. Delegates and their parties had stopped being politely unfamiliar with each other and had reached the stage where people know where they're going to sit and which commissary line they prefer, and whether the environmental temperature in their section is running right. There's a kind of tired, determined normalcy to the third day of a summit. Everyone is focused on getting to a conclusion. The courteous facades are a little thinner, and the actual positions are a little more visible, which is sometimes when you make the most progress and sometimes when things break down. The morning session was addressing the final unresolved clause in the corridor access terms. The Ornathi position and the Thalari position were within workable range of each other, closer than they'd been in a decade, actually, and there was a real possibility that Day 3 would see the framework agreement signed. Everyone in the room who understood what that would mean for trade stability in the outer expanse was quietly, carefully hopeful. That was the atmosphere when the doors opened. Not the main doors. The secondary doors on the east side of the suite, the ones that connect to the administrative corridor, which runs between the negotiation spaces and the station's security and operations wing. 2 figures came through, moving fast but not running. That specific urgent walking pace that says we are moving quickly because time matters, but we are not running because running means something worse. They were Galactic Compact security officers, not DSC. This was the broader station security force, the GCS, which operates separately from the diplomatic protection units. Both were Sefri, which is relevant for reasons I'll explain. Sefri have a bureaucratic culture that places enormous weight on chain of command authority and formal challenge protocol. They don't deviate from procedural escalation. They are thorough, methodical, and they are, most relevant here, extremely literal about their interpretation of security alerts. They had their identity scanners out, and they were moving toward the Thalari delegation, which meant they were moving toward Ambassador Thrin, which meant they were coming directly into the space that Sergeant Dale Morrow was responsible for. The station chief protocol officer, a compact administrative staff member named Verislan, had started to get up from her seat, clearly recognizing something wrong, trying to intercept, trying to handle it through the right channel before it became a physical situation. She was 8 steps away and already too far. Later, much later, after everything, after the reports and the debrief and the formal diplomatic exchange that would take 3 weeks to fully resolve, the reason for the Sefri officer's approach would be made clear. There had been an identity discrepancy in the station's biometric registration system. A Thalari aide's documentation had thrown a flag, a technical error in the biometric scan that the system had generated a security alert about, which was supposed to route to the protocol coordinator's office for review before any contact was made. The alert had instead auto-escalated to the GCS duty officers, who, doing their jobs, following protocol, had moved to investigate. It was a false alarm, a database error completely benign. But in the room, in the moment, with no context, two armed GCS officers moving fast toward a senior diplomat's personal space. It was the kind of thing that has multiple reasonable interpretations, and the safest one is never the most charitable one. Sergeant Morrow was already moving before either GCS officer was 3 steps into the room. What I mean when I say already moving is this. He was in motion while I was still processing that the doors had opened, while the protocol coordinator was still beginning to stand, while the delegates at the table were still turning to see what the sound was. He moved the way I hadn't quite let myself fully believe he would move, the way you can feel is possible when you watch someone carefully and learn their stillness, but that still lands differently when you actually see it. Fast, fluid, completely purposeful, no wasted motion at all, not 1 centimeter of it. He came around the edge of the table on the Larry delegation's side and placed himself between the incoming GCS officers and Ambassador Thrin's position before the officers had covered half the floor. He did it without touching anyone, without raising his voice, without drawing anything. He was unarmed, per the protocol suite rules, just the placement of his body, deliberate and absolute, like a door deciding to be a wall. He put up one hand, an open hand, facing the GCS officers. He said in galactic standard, flat and clear, and with exactly 0 inflection, "Stop! Identify your authority and state the nature of the alert before any further approach to the protected party." His voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. The room had gone very quiet. The 2 Sefri GCS officers stopped. I want to be precise about that. They stopped. Not gradually, not with a slight forward lean of momentum playing out, they stopped, clean and complete, inside 2 steps. I'd like to say that was purely because of his verbal command, but it wasn't entirely. I was watching their faces, or what I could read of Sefri facial communication, which is a narrow channel but present, and what stopped them was something about the totality of him. The voice, yes. The words, yes. But also the absolute conviction of his position. The way his body said, unambiguously, in a language that doesn't need translation, "This line is real, and you will not cross it until I understand what you are doing here." One of the GCS officers began the formal Sefri challenge response, which is, by their protocol, a required recitation before any identification is provided, and Sergeant Morrow waited. He stood exactly where he was, hands still open, breathing slow. He didn't fidget, he didn't glance at the ambassador, he didn't try to fill the silence with anything. He just held the space the way a structure holds a load, completely and without apparent effort. The officer completed the response, stated the authority code, stated the nature of the alert in the formal GCS 2-clause format. Morrow took in the information. A pause, 2 seconds, maybe 3, him processing and cross-referencing and reaching a conclusion. Then he turned his head slightly, not breaking his forward position, not exposing Ambassador Thrin just enough, and said, still in that flat, clear galactic standard, "Protocol Coordinator Verislan, these officers are responding to a biometric flag on your administrative system. Can you confirm the flagged registration and the cause?" Verislan, who had been standing 2 steps away doing what I think can only be described as desperately grateful observing, said, "Yes, confirmed. It's a scan error from the morning intake. The file has the wrong biometric reference attached. There is no security incident." Morrow said to the GCS officers, "Protocol Coordinator confirms database error, no incident. I'm going to ask you to route your formal closeout of this alert through her office rather than this suite. Will you agree to that?" The lead GCS officer, after a pause, a careful one, said yes. Morrow stepped aside, to a position that was still technically between the officers and Ambassador Thrin, but was no longer blocking the path to Verislan's position. The GCS officers moved toward Verislan. She walked them toward the secondary doors. Within 4 minutes they were gone. The door closed. The room was still quiet, and then it stayed quiet for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. I've been in rooms where something significant happens and then everyone immediately starts filling the silence with noise because humans, and apparently most species, are uncomfortable with significant silences. The sound rushes back in. People exhale. Someone says something. The noise normalizes and the moment dissolves. That didn't happen. The silence stretched. And into that silence, while Sergeant Morrow was already moving back to his post, already settling back into his position, hands loose, eyes moving like none of it had been a thing, into that silence, someone on the far side of the room spoke. It was the senior Cavith delegate, Ambassador rank Heth Vral. He was old, Vral old in the Cavith sense, which means he'd been in active military and then diplomatic service for something like 80 standard years. He had the kind of authority that doesn't need volume. He just spoke into the room, and the room listened. He said in Galactic Standard, addressing nobody in particular and everyone in general, "I received the background context document this morning, the one about the human security officer." A pause. He came from Karath 7. He said it the way you'd say the name of a battle, not a location, a battle, with weight. Another pause. The 14th Terran crew. And the room went fully, completely, profoundly silent. Not the quiet of people being polite. The quiet of people absorbing something they hadn't quite assembled from the parts they'd been carrying. Ambassador Thrin turned slowly from the table. Her bioluminescent ridge, which had been the steady silver white of professional concentration all morning, shifted, pulse of gold. Then something cooler, a blue-white I hadn't seen from her before. I'd read that blue-white in the Larry communication indicates something in the territory of recalibration, updating what I thought I knew. She looked at Sergeant Morrow. He was already back at his post, standing, hands loose, eyes moving. The exact same posture he'd held for 3 days, interrupted by 30 seconds of intervening in a way that had just silenced a room full of the galaxy's professional communicators. She said in Galactic Standard, quietly enough that I had to listen hard, "You didn't tell me." He said it wasn't relevant to the assignment, Ambassador. She said Karath 7. He said yes. A pause, and then she said something remarkable. The reports say the people there fought for 17 days with nothing, against a full blockade force. He said they had what they needed. She said, what did they have? He said each other and enough reason. The blue-white ridge held for a long moment, then it shifted slowly to gold. Here's the thing about that moment that I've turned over 100 times since. He wasn't trying to be profound. He wasn't performing anything. He was answering a question plainly because she'd asked it, and that was the plain answer. They had each other and enough reason. Which, if you know what the 17 days actually looked like. The cold, the resource rationing, the improvised defense systems built out of mining equipment and thermal relays, and 62 years ago, no real expectation of survival. If you know what it actually looked like, then you know that each other and enough reason is simultaneously the most modest and most staggering answer he could have given. Because enough reason doesn't mean a good reason. It doesn't mean a reasonable reason. It means there was enough reason to keep going when stopping was the easier option, when stopping was the rational option. When the math of survival said stop, there was enough reason to say not yet. That's a different kind of thing. And everyone in that room understood it in their different ways. I could see it, the adjustment of posture, the quality of attention. The way the Sefri protocol officer near the wall was very carefully not looking directly at Morrow in the way that some species handle the presence of something they find difficult to look at steadily. Heth Vral, the Cavith ambassador, said, "My people remember Karath 7. Morrow said, "I know." Vral said, "We remember it differently than we once did." A pause. Morrow said, "That matters." 2 words, "that matters," and they landed in the room like they had mass. The session resumed about 8 minutes after the GCS officers left. What resumed, I mean, is the physical fact of people in chairs with documents and the treaty language being discussed. But the texture of the room was different now. Something had been said, or not said, or implied, or witnessed that had changed the molecular composition of the air. Texture again. The Ornathi delegate, Presser Vihan, who had been the most immovable position in the room for 2 full days, made a concession on the access window language at 10:43 that his own aides looked surprised by. I don't know if those things are connected. I genuinely don't know. Maybe it was just timing. Maybe the math of the negotiation just finally worked out at that moment. But I noticed it and I wrote it down. Ornathi concession at 10:43. Room dynamic had shifted following the Marovral exchange. Possible correlation, uncertain causality. The framework agreement was initialed at 15:37 on day 3. 4 days ahead of the scheduled conclusion. Part 4, what remained after? I want to tell you about 2 more things that happened before I close this account out, because they both feel like they belong to the story and neither of them is dramatic in the way the treaty suite was, and I think that matters. The first is something I overheard. After the initialing ceremony, which was its own formal thing, lots of stamp readers and attestations, and the particular satisfaction of watching something actually get done, there was a closing reception in the grand reception chamber. Drinks and the interspecies equivalent of canapés, and the kind of exhausted, relieved social maneuvering that happens when people have been in intense negotiation and have finally gotten somewhere. Ambassador Thrin was near the window array, the station's exterior view panels that show the actual stars, and she had a glass of something silver in her hand, and she was talking to Sergeant Morrow in a way she hadn't talked to him before. Not the measured professional address of the past 3 days, something quieter. I wasn't close enough to get the words. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop exactly. I was doing my observer thing near that side of the room, but the distance was such that I got sounds rather than language. What I could read was this. She was asking him something, and he was answering it slowly, and she was listening in the particular Thalari way where the bioluminescent ridge stays very still and the listening is complete. Not waiting for her turn, just receiving what he was saying. After a while, she said something that made him, and this was small enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching closely, made him look down for a moment. Briefly, like something had landed somewhere that wasn't fully armored. Then he looked up, said something. She responded, and her ridge pulsed to a warm, steady gold and stayed there for the rest of their conversation. I'll never know what was said. But the quality of it, the aftermath of it, what each of them looked like coming out the other side, told me it was something real. Not diplomatic, not professional, something actual. The second thing, the Kavith senior security officer, the one from the corridor, the one who had paused and looked back on day 1, found Morrow near the exit as the reception was winding down. He stopped in front of him, they looked at each other. The Kavith officer put his right hand to his chest, flat palm, over the central plating, a gesture that I recognized from my preparatory reading as a Kavith formal acknowledgement of peer standing. It's not a bow. It's not a salute. It's something closer to recognition. I see you as someone worth seeing. Sergeant Morrow looked at him for a long moment. Then he put his own right hand to his chest, the mirror of it, because he knew the gesture, because of course he knew. Because a man who spent 11 years in the 14th TRC knows the vocabulary of people who used to be adversaries. They stood like that for about 3 seconds. Then both hands came down. The Kavith officer moved on. Morrow watched him go, and for a fraction of a second the stillness slipped, and on his face was something I couldn't fully name, something complicated and lived in and not entirely comfortable. The way the long aftermath of hard things sometimes looks on the faces of people who carry them quietly. Then the stillness came back. He went to the door, he went back to his post. I left Orbital Station Viral on the morning of day 5, on the transport back to the Academy. I sat in the passenger compartment and watched the station shrink behind us in the aft viewport and thought about all of it. The 3 days, the room, the silence, the moment, the hand on the chest. I thought about what I'd write in my formal observation report. I thought about what I'd write in this one, the personal log, the one that wasn't going anywhere official. And I kept coming back to the same thing, the image I couldn't get past. A man standing 3 steps behind a diplomat for 3 days, perfectly still, hands loose, eyes moving through a room. Doing a job that looks from the outside like standing there, like waiting, like something passive. And then 30 seconds when the thing he'd been doing for 3 days, the job underneath the job. The constant low-frequency work of knowing exactly where everything was and what everything meant, and where the line was 30 seconds when all of that became visible. And the room went silent, because they understood all at once what they'd been sharing a space with. A man who'd come from a place where people had nothing but each other and enough reason. Who'd spent 11 years getting better at being exactly that. Who was now standing 3 steps behind a diplomat, hands loose, doing the quiet work, and not saying a word about any of it unless directly asked. The last thing, when I was packing to leave, I went back to the commissary one more time. Early morning again, 500, that same skeleton hour quality. He was there. Same corner table, same mug between both hands, looking at the middle distance. I got my coffee, I sat down, same 2 tables away. This time I said, "The room went quiet when they figured out where you came from." He didn't say anything for a moment. "Then rooms do that." I said, "Did you expect it?" He looked at the middle distance for a while. Then he said, "I expected to do the job. What the room does after, that's the room's business." I sat with that. Then I said, "Do you ever think about Karath 7, the people there?" The longest pause. Then every day. He didn't say it like a wound. He didn't say it like a war story. He said it the way you say something that's just true, flat and real, and carrying its own weight without needing any weight from you. Every day. I finished my coffee. "Thank you for the job you did," I said, "in there." He looked at me for the first time since I'd sat down, direct, just for a moment. He said, "Go learn something," and went back to his mug and the middle distance. I've been a cadet observer for 2 years since then. I've been at 6 summits, 3 arbitration sessions, 1 emergency species rights hearing that lasted 11 days and nearly fell apart 4 times. I've seen more since then. Bigger rooms, higher stakes, names you'd actually recognize. But I think about viral. I think about the 3rd day and the room going silent. I think about what it takes to stand very, very still for 3 days, hands loose watching, so that when 30 seconds come that need everything you have it. I think about what it means to carry something like Karath 7, a place where 300 people fought with nothing but each other and enough reason, and to carry it quietly, and to show up in a pressed gray uniform and to do the job.